Welcome back. No wars have been fought on North American soil since the bloody U.S. Civil War ended in 1865, 161 years ago. By contrast, since 1865, European countries have hosted more than 20 wars, including World Wars I and II. And these alone killed about 100 million people. And Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine continues to this day, with hundreds of thousands killed over the past 4 years. Small wonder that our European relatives lived with an almost constant possibility of war, and why most 19th and early 20th century European countries kept a well-trained standing military, maintained in large part by mandatory conscription. Under Austrian Habsburg rule, all males of our grandparents' generation were eligible for conscription at the age of 18 to serve 3 years in the military. My grandfather Frank Lang, my great-uncle John Lang, and their contemporaries were fortunate to serve in those rare times of relative peace. But when faraway Canada offered free land without military conscription, many of our elders said enough and emigrated to faraway conscription-free Canada. Turns out it wasn't far enough. In 1914, scarcely 10 years after setting foot on Canadian soil, their new country had declared war on their old country, and once again, our elders feared for their sons, in this case, unnecessarily. The loyalties of any settler from Germany or Austria-Hungary who arrived after 1902 were suspect, and thus exempted from conscription and barred from enlisting. But when Canada declared war on Germany 25 years later in the fall of 1939, not only were the young men in our family now eligible to serve, they could also be conscripted, just as their cousins in Europe would be forced to fight for Germany. And thus, for the first time in known family history, the potential for cousins on one side of a war to kill cousins on the other side was realized. In December 1939, far away in the Smorzanka Valley and beyond to Bukovina, the Bohemian settlers were shocked when Soviet troops marched into their villages. They knew that Hitler's armies had annexed Poland, and feeling oppressed under Polish occupation since 1919, they were hoping to greet a liberating German army. But under the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact, Soviets and Germans became allies. The Soviets, acting as agents for Germany, offered the villagers a choice: live under Soviet rule or emigrate back to their Heims im Reich, home in the Empire, in Germany. Memories of the Russians slaughtering their families in World War I were still fresh, so not surprisingly, the entire population of Bohemian settlers opted to leave. 100 years after their Bohemian ancestors trekked here to develop the Smorzanka Valley, their descendants were now abandoning their villages and farms to live, for the first time in hundreds of years, in Germany. They set out on foot, by wagon and by train, on a trip that was arduous and terrifying. Siegfried Lang was only a 5-year-old boy at the time, but he remembered being on the train with the others. He remembered Jews and some Poles being singled out at whistle stops, then lined up against the wall and murdered. These horrific images stayed with him for a lifetime. Siegfried was with his grandfather Michael Lang, his father Joseph, mother Anna Pampel, and his uncle Johann Lang, as far as we know. On January 6, 1940, to their great disappointment, they arrived, not in Germany, but in Lodz, Poland. Heims im Reich, it turned out, referred to home in any territory under German occupation. Worse, they were welcomed by being locked up in a concentration camp under deplorable conditions. And they would stay there, pending being cleared by the SS. A word about the SS, the Schutzstaffel. Created as Hitler's personal guard in the 1930s, The SS had its own uniforms, readily identified by the two lightning bolt SS insignias on their lapels, and a silver skull on their caps, the Totenkopf. They had their own ranks, but unlike the German military who took loyalty oaths to their country, the SS demanded ideological loyalty to Hitler. Initially, SS troops had little or no military training, nor were they an actual part of the German army, which generally looked down on the SS. Eventually, largely through conscription, it grew into a massive armed militia, expanding to about 850,000 personnel by the end of 1944. After the German army invaded Poland in 1939, the SS followed the army to oversee and execute Hitler's political and racial policies, identifying Jews, Roma, intelligentsia, communists, and any other perceived enemies of the Reich, including Poles. And since our relatives came from Polish-occupied Galicia, where many villages included a large Jewish population, the SS was keen to determine where our people's loyalties lay, and who among them might be Jewish. The SS called our people Volkdeutschers, people whose language and culture was German, but who were registered as Polish citizens. According to Siegfried, the Langs were terrified at the prospect of incarceration or worse. None on this side of the family were known to be Jewish or descended from Jews, but their villages included many Jews and many of our families spoke Yiddish, which could raise an SS eyebrow. Our family should know that had my grandparents, Max and Teresia, stayed in Bukovina and raised their family there, and had they been among those to arrive in Lodz, they most likely would have all been executed at the Nazis' first extermination camp at Chulmo, just 50 kilometers from Lodz, where all the Jews were sent. Because Teresia's mother, Marianna Rosenbaum, was Jewish, her children and grandchildren would all be considered Jewish. One Jewish grandparent was interpreted as being 25% Jewish, far above the minimum 12%. By that math, all of my siblings and cousins on my father's side would also have been considered Jewish enough to be sent to a death camp. As for the fate of the Rosenbaums, most likely they all perished. But Johann Lang managed to convince the SS to allow the terrified Lang family to leave, upon which they were granted a Polish farm, the SS having killed or incarcerated the previous Polish owners. Siegfried said that he remembers his grandfather Michael, my great-grandfather on my mother's side, being at the camp and most likely died there, although he may have survived for a time on the farm. Michael was 95 years old. He was one tough old man. By 1941, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was shredded, and the German army was now at war with the Soviets and advancing eastward toward Lemberg, known today as Lviv. My grandfather Frank's first cousin, another Michael Lang, was living in Lemberg when the city fell on June 30th, 1941, and he was taken prisoner. The SS were particularly suspicious of him because many German-speaking Galicians had been conscripted into the Polish army and had fought and lost to the Germans. Michael was incarcerated for 2 years in a forced labor camp near Lemberg, building barracks for Polish prisoners. By 1943, the war on the Eastern Front was going badly for Germany, and like so many men in our family in Eastern Europe, Michael was now German enough to be conscripted to fight the Soviets. A graduate of the University of Lemberg, he was a linguist, speaking perfect Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, and English. So, not surprisingly, he was trained as a communications officer, and after 3 months he was stationed with the Flak Battalion and sent to the Eastern Front. For most, this was the equivalent of a death sentence, because the eventual German death toll on the Eastern Front was a staggering 3.5 to 4 million casualties. Incredibly, Michael survived, and when the war was over, he once again became a prisoner of war. Upon release, he settled near Weilheim, Bavaria, where he married his wife, Erna Putz, seen here in 1962 with my Aunt Rose Lang, his first cousin, once removed. Michael was among dozens of close and extended family members who served with the German army, and in many cases died in World War II. Here's a partial list of some of our European family killed in action. Many, many more likely died as civilians from bombing or starvation. A world away in Saskatchewan, our relatives were aware that their European cousins would be conscripted into the German army, which is why some, like distant relative Rudy Deitch of Quinton, didn't wait to be conscripted. He volunteered and immediately requested a non-combatant role as a medic. Dad and his brother Bill were not eligible for the draft because married farmers, with children especially, were exempt. His unmarried brothers Carl, Edward, and Fern were not. Nor were his brother-in-law Rudy Lang, his future brothers-in-law Steve Catella and Pat Hanlon, or his cousin Frankie Hoffmeister, among others. On the Hinger side, 3 Cooper brothers served: Bob, Don, and Bill, as well as Adam Fesser, who was married to Agnes Hinger, Grandma Teresa's half-sister. Conscripted or volunteered, all of them signed up, although not all saw action. My mother's brother Rudy quit his job as a teacher in Limerick, Sask, to join the RCAF. He trained as an air gunner and wireless operator, but as he was fluent in German, he was soon recruited to a top-secret unit where he trained for special ops. Equipped with American B-17 flying fortresses, each special ops plane would accompany a bombing group. But the bomb bay held no bombs. It contained a massive radio transmitter they called an ABC, or airborne cigar, loaded secretly in the dark. The navigator wireless operators of each plane were the only members of the crew who knew the purpose of the missions. Not even Rudy's captain, Jeff Bray, understood the missions. Because rather than descending on a bomb run, they would circle high above while their German-speaking wireless operators were to listen for German transmissions and jam them with the powerful VHF transmitter. In all, Rudy completed the maximum 30 missions, including those over Nuremberg, a 1,000 bomber raid over Essen, and another over Cologne, where his sister Rose was married just 10 years earlier. Circling at 30,000 feet, where the outside air was minus 30 or colder, he said sometimes the floor beneath his feet was warm from the burning cities below. He credits his survival to his captain, Jeff Bray, who, when not on missions, practiced evasive maneuvers at every opportunity, much to the dismay of his crew. On bombing missions, the greatest danger was flak. Explosive shells with timers fired from the ground that exploded at set altitudes. In the movies, you see these as little puffs of black smoke. In reality, each explosion blasted hundreds of shards of steel into the air around it. Night provided a degree of safety, but enemy searchlights from below scanned the sky for planes, and it was most often fatal to be caught in the cone of a searchlight, which made you an easy target for anti-aircraft fire. We don't often appreciate the sheer horror crews experienced on these missions because the survivors' notes seemed matter of fact. From 1942 to 1945, more than 6,000 bombers and crew, American and British, did not return from missions. The odds of survival were poor indeed. On one mission, Rudy simply notes, Ops, Bochum, 20 minutes over heavy defenses, caught by a searchlight. As I said, rather matter of fact, considering a fiery death would have been likely. The procedure when coned required the pilot to put the plane into a violent spiral dive, left, then right, then left, until they escaped the searchlight, or were shot down, and thousands were. From 30,000 feet, Jeff threw the B-17 into a spiral dive, and thanks to his skills, they escaped the cone, but only for a few moments when they were coned a second time, unheard of. By the time Jeff pulled the massive bomber out of the second spiral dive, they had dropped more than 25,000 feet and lived to fly home. 30 missions was Rudy's ticket home. His cheerfully colored logbook entry notes the final mission took 9 hours and 20 minutes over 6 countries, crossed the Alps twice, and survived an attack by an Me-109 night fighter. On my father's side of the family, Dad's brother Carl, a bachelor sometimes known as Charlie, he signed his letters Chaz, rented out his farm across the road from Mom and Dad, and moved to Vancouver, where he worked as a lumber filer. A surprise to some, in 1942 he also joined the Vancouver-based Seaforth Highlanders as a rifleman, or private. Some family have said he enlisted in part because somebody in the family had to go. After his final goodbye to his parents, his mother said, "I will never see my son again." On February 10, 1943, Carl signed on for active duty and soon was training in England, where he didn't like the cold and rainy weather. He didn't care for English cigarettes either, which he said will do as long as they don't cost anything. All letters were censored, so he couldn't say where he was after England, but we know at some time he was stationed with his brother-in-law-to-be, Pat Hanlon, and Rudy Deitch from Quinton. Rudy was shocked that Carl signed up as a rifleman.
Yeah, because the last time I saw him as an Aldershot, and I didn't know I don't know why he joined the infantry for. He could have went to the ordnance, the service, or the medical like I did, or anything else. Why did he join the infantry?
Why do you think?
He was such a nice guy, so calm, and why did he go in the infantry? I don't know.
Rudy was puzzled because foot soldiers experienced a high casualty rate, unlike medics and stretcher bearers. Carl and the Seaforth Islanders, along with Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, or the PPCLIs, Rudy Deitch's battalion, were part of the celebrated 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade. After landing and fighting through Sicily, they moved up the Italian peninsula, and in December 1943, they took the town of Ortona, Italy, defended by Hitler's top airborne brigade, charged with defending it at all costs. The battle was so fierce and bloody that none of the troops expected to live. When the dust cleared, the survivors included Carl and Rudy, who met him after the battle, surprised he was part of the offensive.
So and the first time I saw him is after Ortona. When we moved back to Lochera for 3 days, we had to take all our Canada badges off, our red badge off, and as disguised as English troops, cross the Pyrenees Mountains to the Mediterranean side, and then to the Leary Valley, and then the Hitler Line.
The Battle of the heavily fortified Hitler Line, which stretched across the Leary Valley northwest of Monte Cassino. In the longest bombardment of the war to date, the 1st Canadian Armored Division pounded the German defenses for days. Peter Stursberg of CBC News reported during the battle.
The attack on the Adolf Hitler Line has begun. Canadian infantrymen and Canadian and British tanks are now storming its outer defenses. Our troops are being supported by one of the heaviest artillery concentrations of this war. Just listen to those guns roar.
The day before the Seaforth Islanders were to charge the line, Carl wrote a letter home saying, "Tomorrow I'll know what real action is." The Engineer Corps took several hours to blow holes in the rolls of barbed wire ahead. Then the signal was given and Carl charged the line.
They mowed them down. The jerry bunkers were on the other side, cement bunkers, and they just kept mowing us down. We pulled parts of bodies off the wire or whatnot. And Charlie got hit coming back out after they broke the line. After they were coming back out, 3 days before they went in the Hitler Line, he shook my hand. He says, "Rudy, I won't see you again." And sure enough, I picked him up with a bullet hole through that. There were so many dead laying around that 3 days later, we didn't have our wounded and our dead picked up. I remember throwing Charlie on a flatbed.
The first day, or?
Yeah.
Dad's first cousin, Frankie Hoffmeister, nicknamed Shorty, was just the right size for the armored corps as he fit nicely into a tank. Unknown to Rudy Deitch, Frankie's tank was among hundreds that took part in the initial bombardment. When it was all over, Frankie found Carl's body among the casualties. As he was Carl's first cousin, he was allowed to take his small pile of possessions, which he sent back to Max and Teresa in Saskatchewan. The whole family was traumatized by Carl's death. Carl was more than a brother to my dad, he was also his best friend. Known as a gentle, quiet man, well loved by his brothers and sisters, he now lies at rest in Italy, where then Father Klein, Annie Schenofer, Mrs. John Degelman, Mr. Mattei, and Philip Hartle visited his grave in 1950. As the war dragged on, soon it was Edward's turn to sign up. He also decided to join the RCAF, following his cousin Rudy.
What are you interested in? He said, don't say pilot, because he said we got hundreds of people coming in that want pilots, and he said if you wash out as a pilot, you're finished with aircrew. You can't go up in aircrew. Well, I told him, I said, well, I had one of my cousins, I knew then that, said one of my cousins said, was a Wallace air gunner. Yeah. And he made 33 trips, I think, over Germany or something. Wow. He has already finished with that. Wow. So I said, I'll go in as a Wallace air gunner. So they sent me to Edmonton. In fact, I was in charge of 25 people on a train because I was a teacher. Somebody gave me to all to look after these guys. Some guys wanted to stay over in one place. No way.
He trained as a navigator at the base in Defo, as well as in New Brunswick. The war ended before Edward would see action, but Steve Catella joined the Army likely early 1944 and served in the now celebrated Intelligence Corps as a codebreaker. Meanwhile, on the prairies, life went on despite the war in Europe. Max and Terezia's unmarried children were no longer children and were getting married in batches. Steve Catella, mentioned above, married Ella Lang, and, as she told me, 2 weeks later he left to serve in the Army and she didn't see him for 2 years. Imagine that. To be honest, I can't imagine that, but war creates these impossible scenarios. And speaking of weddings, here are pictures of Steve and Ella's wedding. Also, Ed and Rita. Ed said his parents surprised him by showing up at his wedding in Vancouver. He met Rita when she was working in a restaurant he frequented. And here's Agnes and Mike Benko, who had just one child, Wayne, for whom I have no photos. Dad's sister Rose married Joe Petro on July 11, 1940. Joe immigrated from Romania to Canada on April 27, 1929 as Juan Petrovici, likely changed by immigration officers to the simpler Joe Petro. He tried farming with Grandpa Max, but they were not a good fit, as it were. An experienced blacksmith, after marriage, Joe set up shop in Quinton, where he did metal work for farmers in the area. I recall him working his trade, bellows howling, sparks flying. He also built closed-in cutters, including our own, seen here, and he fashioned this cross atop the steeple of the church in Quinton. Fern, Max and Terezia's youngest, married Frances Mitchell, daughter of Ignatius Mitchell, who was teaching at Wallenstein at the time. Fern took over Max's farm in 1947 when Max and Terezia moved into Raymore. After the war, Pat Hanlon, who knew Carl during the war, fell for Dad's youngest sister, Marie. After all those weddings, a swack of children began popping up like mushrooms. Here's a memorable 1949 photo taken on Max and Terezia's couch in Raymore. This is me, and here are Gabe and Zita's first of two sets of twins, Merv and Marcia. Then Steve and Ella's firstborn, Bernadette Catella, born in 46. This smiling cherub is Ed and Rita's Mary. Then a consensus thinks this could be Chuck Catella, some question about this, and finally Charles, firstborn of Fern and Francis, and later in 1949 his brother Patrick arrived. Others born in the 40s, my brother Ed, December 15th, 1943, born the day Uncle Rudy shipped out for England. Ed was the first in our family to be born in a hospital. Here's Rita, Gabe and Zita's third child, and their fifth and sixth twins, Claude Max, the only one named for Max, and Claudia. Then Joan, Ed and Rita's first, and I'm sure there are many more I've missed, with apologies. And of course Carl, whom we knew as Uncle Charlie, did not marry and had no children, but he had several namesakes. Named after him, first or second names, Charles Lang, Charles Chuck Catella, James Charles Lang, that would be me, my brother Edmund Charles Lang, and likely more. By 1947, my grandparents on both sides were ready for retirement. Max, Teresa, Frank, and Agatha sold their farms and moved to Raymore, ending up a block or so from each other. Max's farm went to his son Fern, and Frank's farm to Bill Lawrence Lang. Max and Teresia moved into a house that he frequently mentioned had 7 gables, and he added a porch and some stained glass windows. Frank and Agatha's house was smaller, with a sun porch where Frank would read papers and magazines, and he had a penchant for drawing mustaches on famous women, especially. Also in 1947, Jack House drove away from a visit to the dentist when he passed away, his car rolling to a stop beside the road. No one knows why. His wife, our Auntie Agnes, lived for many years. Here she is in 1982 with Dad, trying one of her donuts. Attentive viewers may recall that Dad lived with her and Jack in 1920, on what we would later call the North Quarter, which Dad bought in 1944 for $3,000. Around 1948, Dad bought a John Deere AR tractor and retired our draft horses. Things were looking up. As for our European relatives, life after the war was chaos. Relatives wearing German uniforms became prisoners of war across Europe and in Canada and the U.S. Canada operated over 25 major sites, including Camp 132 in Medicine Hat and Camp 133 in Lethbridge, holding over 35,000 prisoners at their peak. The United States handled over 400,000 prisoners in more than 500 camps. I met one of these prisoners in 1967 when I was working in a hospital in Siegburg, not far from Cologne. Angry one day, the man swore a blue streak in English. I asked him where he learned that, and he said, in a prisoner of war camp in Alabama. During and after imprisonment, our relatives tried with great difficulty to reconnect with their families. In one case, Edmund Rice, my great-uncle on my mother's side, tried to get a letter to my grandfather Frank Lang in Raymore. In this letter, he notes that the only address he had for family was for Wenzel Hartl in Argentina, who sent the letter on to George Lang's son Michael in Weilheim, Germany, who then sent it to Grandpa Frank. Other survivors tell of walking hundreds of kilometers across war-torn Germany. One family relative tells of multiple assaults by Russian soldiers before making her way to Bavaria. And the stories of the Langs' exodus from Felicienthal paralleled stories of other relatives forced to leave Bukowina for the same reasons. In one example, Rosal Bellman was 17 when she and her family arrived back in Germany after the war. Rosal was our great-grandfather Anton Hinger's niece, so she would have been our grandmother Teresa's first cousin. Rosal recalls that on arrival in Germany, everywhere the air was filled with the stench of decaying bodies. And what may be surprising to North Americans, she said that the children were taught that it was the Allies who did this, who destroyed their cities, which of course was true, but were not used to being thought of as the bad guys, as it were, in this war. This is important for us to know, because many of us thought that as soon as the war was over, all the Germans realized how wrong we had been. For later generations, this is largely true, but if you imagine that the genocidal SS and others underwent a soul-searching transformation after the war, I can tell you I've heard personal accounts of surviving SS members spewing racist hatred to their deathbeds as late as the 1980s and into the 1990s. As for Rosal, she thrived in Germany, blessed with children and grandchildren, all still living in Germany. And while we're focused on the 1940s and the Hinger clan, Regina, the family's matriarch, passed away in 1940. This photograph of her lying at rest is an excellent picture of the many entangled relationships between families. Here is grandmother Teresia Lang, born Hinger, Regina's stepdaughter. This is my other grandmother, Agatha Lang, born Rice, Regina's youngest sister, and Teresia's aunt by marriage. Agnes Compert, born Lang, daughter of George Lang and Teresia Rice, was Regina's and Agatha's sister. Agnes was thus both Teresia's and Agatha's first cousin. Here is Bill, brother of Max Lang and husband of Anna Hinger, Regina's daughter. I'll stop there. Any more is likely to simply confuse all of us even more. Of interest to all of us descended from our Bohemian ancestors, yet one more key historical tragedy unfolded after the war. Just as Felicienthal and its sister villages were abandoned by all the German-speaking inhabitants 100 years after they arrived from Bohemia, in 1948, furious with the desire to punish all Germans for the war, the Czechs exiled all the remaining Germans from the Sudetenland, the ancestral villages of our ancestors, Hesselsdorf, Wusleben, and all, after they'd lived there for almost 300 years. Much worse, between 15,000 and 30,000 Bohemian Germans were massacred by the Czechs. To this day, we don't know if any of our cousins killed any other cousins, but it's entirely possible that a bomb or bullet from one side ended a life on the other. Indeed, war is hell, according to everyone who survived one or who lost a loved one. And as the 40s drew to a close, the war had slowly started to disappear in the rearview mirror. Everyone avoided talk of war. They longed for peace and stability. And in many ways, they found it in the 1950s. Because we rarely hear of people referring to the 1940s as the good old days, and for good reason. In the next episode, I explore those nifty 50s, a time of multicolored cars, of progress writ large, and fears of communists under every bed. It was a decade of contrast, life on farms without electricity and burgeoning modern cities. And a time when the next generation, born of the children of Bohemian immigrants to Canada, started to marry, have children of their own, and in many cases spread out across Canada and the United States. Thanks for watching.
Grab your coat and grab your hat. Leave your worries on the doorstep. Life could be so sweet on the sunny side of the street.